from Kqed and formerly SF Examiner with me, and Laura Waxmann from SF Business Times, also formerly Examiner, Otis R. Taylor Jr., Kqed, Jacob Simas from the Oaklandside, and then myself will just be doing some introductions. So I'll get over to the next slide then. I just wanted to show you guys some of the basic terms to know when interacting with journalists. Some of these are the major jargony terms, but there's other ways you can talk to journalists when you want to set certain parameters that are agreed upon. So the first one to know is on the record. It's the assumed state of the conversation, unless otherwise stated, that you can put things in the newspaper or on broadcast unless stated otherwise. And then when you want to go off the record, that's something more to be agreed upon. Sometimes the journalists may not agree. There's reasons for sources to have their reasons for wanting to go off the record. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's just privacy, sensitivity. But that means it's said in confidence and not necessarily for publication. And then there's on background, and it can vary what this means depending on each journalist. So when you're talking to them, you can either be a little more specific of like, I don't want my name attached to this for this reason. And then the journalist will say yes or no. And maybe you discuss it a little bit. And then deep background, it also varies, but it tends to just be a stricter version of the one before. And I put a link there at the bottom. That's kind of where I pulled some of this from. The New York Times had a good explainer on some of these terms and how journalists, how those vary and why they employ them or not. So now to get started with introducing our panelists. As mentioned, we have Shanti Singh. She's the Communications and Legislative Director of Tenants Together. She also sits on the Local Agency Formation Commission, as well as the San Francisco Community Land Trust. And she used to co-chair the San Francisco Democratic Socialists of America. And Laura Waxmann is a real estate and economic development reporter. She writes about Bay Area people, places, and space for the San Francisco Business Times. Her coverage areas include commercial real estate and housing issues, land use, and public policy pertaining to her beat. And then we also have Otis R. Taylor Jr. He's a supervising senior editor of race and equity at Kqed. He focuses on the role of systemic inequity in journalism and works with reporters and senior editors to bring a cultural competency to story production and editing as we reframe the station's coverage of diverse communities. And we've got Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez. He's a reporter and digital producer for Kqed covering housing. He was raised in San Francisco and spent his reporting career in his beloved foggy city by the bay. You can tell he wrote that part. Joe was 12 years old when he conducted his first interview in journalism, grilling former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown for the Marina Middle School newspaper, the Penguin Press, for the newspaper Penguin Press, and he continues to report on the San Francisco Bay Area to this day. And we've got also Jacob Simas. He's managing editor at the Oaklandside. It's an independent nonprofit newsroom that launched last year to cover arts and community, city hall and policing, schools, housing and homelessness, health and the environment, and small businesses in Oakland through an equity lens. So welcome everybody, and I'll hand things off to Shanti now.
Awesome. Thank you so much all for having me. And I'm super excited. It's been a busy week in Sacramento where most of my job things are concerned. And I've been talking to a lot of journalists. So I'm super excited that now I get to ask the questions because now I'm a little bit tired of answering them after what a week it's been. So I'm gonna start like popcorn passing. We have a bunch of questions. Hopefully we can get to them by 4:50. If you don't know already, people who are listening, there is going to be an audience Q&A portion. I think, Ida, we are going to use the Q&A tool in Zoom, or we already have questions prepared. Just want to double check that that's how it's going.
Yeah, please pop in with your questions throughout the webinar as they come up. Just send them and we'll make sure to log them so the panelists see them again.
Yep. So that'll start at roughly 4:50. We're going to shoot for that. So Yeah, I'm gonna start. Yeah, I'm gonna popcorn past some of these questions. So one of you is gonna be the surprise first answerer. So like this is called Behind the Journalism Curtain. We're gonna talk about what's behind the journalism curtain, and what a typical day or week looks like for you. And you can talk about in general, or you can talk about things that are special or different during the pandemic, since we've all been living in this different reality for a while. So the question is, what are some of the aspects of your process that don't really appear on the page or the screen that it might actually surprise folks to know that you and journalists in general are spending time doing, whether that's, research, special research, or if it's just tweeting or posting. I know I do a lot of that. So yeah, and anything in between. I'm going to start with, just because I love needling him, I'm going to start with you, Fitz. You're going first.
Oh, snap. Well, I think the thing that I get the most, that I always have the stock answer to, is people like, oh, you must love being a writer. You spend all day writing. You're just writing all the time. And the thing is that the production of the aspect of how that news gets out, to me, is usually just the tip of the iceberg of the work on the news. You're really spending a lot of time talking to people, researching, reading, getting out there and finding the news in the first place, whether it's physically being in a place or combing through social media or documents, depending on what your beat is, what your focus, your topic area focuses on, or if you're a generalist, you might spend 80% of your time not doing the actual writing, whether it's a script or a news article. And I think that's the thing that surprises people the most when they talk to me about what I do. And I love explaining that part to them, because I'm not just picking ideas out of thin air. I'm not just making stuff. I'm not pulling things whole cloth out of nowhere. I'm talking to people, and that's the biggest part of the game, is making sure people are represented in your work. I can popcorn to Otis.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure talking about what we do and interacting with the public when we're not putting a phone or a microphone in their face. So I'm just going to piggyback on what Joe said. A lot of my job has always been listening. I feel that covering marginalized and oppressed communities, which is what I did at the San Francisco Chronicle, what I'm focusing on at Kqed, involves a lot of listening. For so long, journalism would parachute into these communities and give a report that's not based on the reality of lived experiences. And I think it's incumbent upon me and journalism as a whole to spend time with people so you can get the nuanced version of their story. And a minuscule part of my time, overall time, is spent writing or editing. Most of my days are listening to what people have to say, so I can accurately present a portrait of their story. And since we're popcorning, man, who do I want to go to? Jacob, since we have never met in person, but
Yeah.
I respect the game. So Laura, I've actually seen you. I'm gonna go to Jacob. Sorry, Laura, you can hit clean up for us.
Cool. Thank you, Otis. And yeah, thank you also for just inviting me and having me be a part of this conversation. Yeah, I mean, I am really appreciating what Otis just said, and as well as Joe, about listening and speaking to other people. And I guess I'll say that for our newsroom in particular, we're a small team. We're a team of 8 people. 4 reporters, 1 photojournalist, and 3 editors. And so we're not really overly concerned with breaking news at the Oaklandside. We're really more interested in looking at the big issues, the overarching issues in Oakland. What are the forces at play impacting people? And how can we sort of widen the lens to do reporting that's going to just like, increase understanding about these issues for folks. And so I guess if there's one thing I might say that might be a surprise to people if we were to like pull back the curtain is just the amount of time that we spend talking with each other about our stories, right? We spend a lot of time in meetings, having conversations, talking about framing, why are we telling this story? What are we adding to this story that's already been reported on? And whose voices do we feel like aren't being heard and need to be included? Like these sorts of framing questions are a huge part of what we do on a daily basis and just on a weekly basis. We start every week on Mondays with a very deep dive conversation where our reporters are pitching and we're having conversations about stories, and we're coming to a consensus about what we think the framing should be for the stories that we approve and greenlight collectively together. So that's what comes to mind for me, and I'll pitch it to Laura.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm so happy we're having this conversation because it's so frustrating sometimes to work with people who don't really understand how journalism works. So this is really helpful, I think, for everybody. Nice to see you guys. It's been a while. So I think this question kind of just made me think of a post that my friend put on social media, who's also a journalist. And the joke was that 50% of the time is spent, sending follow-up emails. And then the rest is like picking crumbs out of your keyboard. And of course, that's not 100% true, but I think there is a lot of, time where you're just kind of waiting for people to get back to you. And at the Business Times, we have to write 2 stories a day. That's the goal. So I'll be, kind of multitasking and just as I'm working on one story, starting on something else or soothing the internet or, following up with people for something else. So that can be tough sometimes, but also it's what you got to do. I think what Jacob said about communication is so real. I think especially with the pandemic and us working from home, a lot of us, I think we communicate a lot more than we used to. When I went to the newsroom physically, we'd have like a 10-minute meeting in the morning, that's it. Now I'm checking with my editors all the time. We're like talking all the time, Slacking. I'm working with my colleagues. I think the communication has just ramped up so much. So that kind of surprised me a little bit because I always kind of was the lone wolf, and kind of worked on my stuff and turned it in when I had to. So I think that's changed for me. Yeah. Who's next?
No,
that's it.
No, we're on to the next question. We got a lot of questions to squeeze in between now and 4:50 when we will ask you even more questions. But so on the other side of the proverbial journalism curtain, we often hear from members of the public who feel like their stories go untold, especially during this pandemic when there are so many untold stories to tell about everything that people are experiencing during COVID. Why do you think that some people and groups are in the news much more than others, or more often than others? And, how do journalists typically find and choose their sources? How is the industry in general making improvements? And how do you balance or maintain privacy, transparency, and sensitivity? Because this is his area of expertise and something he's been doing for a long time, I'm going to kick it to Otis first this time.
That was a very loaded question.
Sorry.
I have no idea where to start. So I'll start with the industry. And the industry for so long centered whiteness. Whiteness is still centered in the journalism industry. The industry now is trying to correct that. And it's trying to address these inequities that have existed in our society since emancipation, and actually since the founding of this country. And I think the industry has finally realized to do that, we need more diverse voices at the table that are planning the stories, not just going out and going to get the stories, the people who are in the room planning the stories, greenlighting the stories, suggesting the stories. I feel that right now we're seeing this, well, since last summer, but you know, police abuse has been a central issue or theme of my coverage for the last 4 years, 5 years. What we saw was America, I really think more of America realizing that these issues of police accountability, issues of housing affordability, the issues of with COVID, with health, issues with the racial wealth gap are issues that have been present before the world had to stop. And I think our industry is catching up on reporting those stories. Now, with that said, there are some groups who feel that they are being underrepresented now in the reporting, or as readers and listeners like to tell me now, you only report on the people of color. And I very often have to say, well, if we're thinking about, if I'm weighing between your potholes in your road or disproportionate number of Black people living on the street, well, I'm going to pick the disproportionate number of Black people on the street. If it's, well, you know, this bar next door to your home is too loud, or people being evicted while the state has an eviction moratorium, I'm going to go with the people who are being evicted. I'm not speaking for journalism. I'm speaking for myself when I say this, that the people who are being harmed, that is who I think need to be given voice, because without hearing their voices, things aren't going to change. And now I'm going to popcorn to, sorry, Joe, Laura.
Well, I second that, really good point. I kind of want to just talk about, I guess, what we can do to change that. You know, always going to the same sources, and for me, you know, and I feel like it's also an issue of time, and really taking the time to reach the people whose voices need to be lifted. And you know, I just said I have a quota of 2 stories a day, not an excuse, but I'm saying it can be difficult to really put in the work, you know, to really find those people and reach them. And I think journalists, if we're on a deadline, we often go to the sources that we know are going to return our calls, that we know are going to give us the information that we need so that we can meet our deadline. And I think that it's important, you know, for not just the journalists to do the important work of reaching the people who need to tell their stories, but also for the editors and kind of the whole newsroom to be on board with that. And to have stories, you know, where you put in a little bit more time and really do it right. And I think that's something that a lot of newsrooms, because we are, you know, Jacob, you said you're a really small newsroom. I've been in really small newsrooms as well. And I think that's just an issue, you know, scarcity of resources. And I think another thought with what I'm covering now, which is real estate, that's been a really interesting beat for me, because there isn't a lot of diversity, you know, in that industry. Finding a woman who is at the helm of a company who can talk to me is hard. You know, finding, you know, people of color who are in these jobs who are represented is difficult. It takes time, and I think that's kind of my big takeaway from this question. But I will pick on Joe.
Well, just to dovetail off of what you were so wisely saying, Laura, about time, you know, that's also about investment, right? So, you know, when I was at the Examiner as a political columnist, you know, I was churning out many stories a day, sometimes 3 on a really busy day. And how many phone calls can you make when you got to turn 3 stories in? You got to call a certain number for each of those, certain number of people for each of those stories. But at Kqed, I've had the blessing of being able to take sometimes weeks. I've been working on a story, I won't tip my hand too much, about returning to schools and equity related to that. and I had the blessing of following, accompanying, I should say, a student to her first day of in-person learning, of taking the time to talk to members of the community, all from all different aspects of that community. And that takes the largesse of a place that can put those resources there, or focus a smaller place that is focusing only on that. And it's about time, but the time comes from resources, which is why funding news is so important, and supporting your local news institutions is so important, because you may still get the news, maybe it doesn't disappear, but the quality of it changes quite a bit because you don't have that time. Jacob, please take us home.
I'll try. This is all good stuff. And I mean, I would just say, there's a question of people feeling like their stories are going untold, for sure. There's also a slightly different issue of like folks feeling like their stories are being told, but not in the right way. That people's communities are not being portrayed in a way that feels genuine, or that they're not seeing their lives reflected back to them in the coverage that they see of like the news media. So, I think that goes back to something that I think a couple of people have already said, which is, the diversity in our industry, right? I feel that one of the reasons some people feel like their stories go untold is because, their experiences aren't being reflected back to them. And that has to do with the complexion of the news media and the fact that very often the people reporting on impacted communities don't have a strong relationship or tie to those communities that they're serving. So, Otis, you use that phrase like parachuting in. There's a long history. There's like a legacy of news organizations, behaving in this way with certain communities. And so I think it just kind of comes back for me to this need for greater diversity, right, in journalism, and sort of cultivating that. That's not to say that, you have to be a certain person to be able to do good reporting about an issue or a community. Like, absolutely, that's not what I'm saying. But, does it help to have diversity in newsrooms and like have folks feel like, the organization that's covering them is actually a reflection of their community? Like, absolutely, 100%. So, yeah, I just would add that.
Yeah, just to dovetail off that, I think one practice I've really kind of, I don't know, I'm still on the fence about, because we're all, journalists, and we're all should be able to jump in and cover all sorts of things. But something I felt continuing to feel stronger and stronger about is to have an editor who has an eye to the community that I'm writing about, to take a look and weigh in. Like, even if they're not my direct editor on something, like, especially if that coverage is about that community, I really want someone with that eye to say whether I hit the mark or miss something that's really key, an observation about that community. And I've been finding myself asking for that more and more. And I wonder if we should if that should be more formalized in our profession.
Just to add, second everything that everyone's saying, so good. But also, I think staying on a story, and we're all parachuting in at some point, right? I mean, that's how we all start. So I think really staying on a story that is important and continuing to do coverage on it, beat reporting, whatever you want to call it, is important, because that's how you meet those people. That's how you build trust with people who maybe haven't had that voice or haven't had somebody put a microphone in their face, and they'll come back to you and talk to you. And I was just thinking with the Examiner, one of my favorite stories, that I still, every time I hear about the Bayview, I'm so excited. Was the Hunters Point shipyard and everything that happened there. And I remember, first coming into that community, not being from that community, and also, feeling a little bit of animosity, or not even animosity, but just like hesitancy, like, what do you want, And I understand. And I think it just really took time for me to show up, show face. This was obviously, we're all doing in-person stuff. And, call people up and just have those relationships, have coffee and talk. And I think, so beat reporting and really just staying on a topic and staying on a beat and not just letting it go or doing a one-time jump in is important.
I have to say, I'm really struck by the way that the similarities between the way that y'all are approaching your stories and investing in communities and really getting the story right. It reminds me so, and talking about listening, all of this reminds me about like organizing 101. Like it's very much, there's so many different similarities between good journalism and organizing. So yeah, I was just had to note that I was really struck by that, especially Laura, as someone who like has also had that like trying to support actually from an organizing standpoint on the Hunters Point shipyard stuff, and like having to kind of go through that same process as an outsider. So yeah, and again, we're probably gonna come back to this question because it's a really big question. It'll show itself in other questions, but it is, since it's 4:27, I'll move on to the next one. Which is, and it's kind of related to what you guys are already talking about, right? Do you decide what stories you want to cover? And, of course, there's conflicts, or not conflicts necessarily. We got to balance that with the stuff that you want to stay on long term. Or do you receive assignments? Is it both? What are ways that are helpful to y'all in which audiences can provide input and catch your attention? And what stories, again, we've touched on this a little bit, but if you have a specific one or something that's been on your mind, like what stories or issues that have happened during COVID do you feel weren't getting enough coverage in general, or a story that you or a topic that you particularly felt the need to work to bring justice to? And I guess I'm going to start with Jacob this time. Trying to move it around.
Cool. Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, there's a few questions in there. I'll try to do my best to kind of unpack them a little bit. So in terms of just our process and how stories get, assigned or not assigned, we're a pretty democratic newsroom in the sense that, again, like we're small, we have a lot of conversations. It's not the place where editors are telling reporters, this is your assignment, like you got to do this. We're really looking to our reporters to come to us with the ideas, because they're the ones that are really kind of digging into their beats, and like we want to hear from them. We want to learn from them what's going on in Oakland on their beat. And so, they bring their ideas to us and we have conversations, and every once in a while as editors we'll say like, hey, we got to, we need to cover this. But it's usually like we're all already on the same page about it anyways. So mostly it's just like ideas being generated by reporters, and like we discuss those and then we make a decision about, how we want to go about reporting it. Not a lot of assigning going on. I think I may be skipping something else that was in your question, but I wanted to get to this, like in terms of stories during the pandemic, because we actually launched during the pandemic. Like we launched in June last year. So all we really know is pandemic. We've been like almost all of our stories touch in some way on the pandemic, over the last, 14 months or what have you, year. But there are stories that have been sort of percolating and needing attention. I would say that one of those for us in Oakland was definitely gun violence, and the rise in gun violence that we saw really mirroring the pandemic. And a lot of people are talking about this now, right? But there was a time when I think people were just kind of not aware or trying to wrap their heads around it and figure out like what's going on. Is violence going up? And it was something that we were hearing from community health providers in East Oakland that, hey, this is like the other thing that people aren't talking about right now, but this is a big issue. And so, I'm not going to say we've done an adequate job covering that topic. I actually think that we haven't done enough. But we were able to do one sort of almost like a curtain raiser piece, if you will, that came from a community member that was really steeped in lived experience and who could educate us about this issue and had ideas about why we were seeing this uptick in gun violence during the pandemic, and brought in a lot of Oakland history to also provide context for what's happening now, and just kind of allowed us to begin having a conversation about this and kind of unpacking it. So that was one story that immediately came to mind. It was written by a gentleman named John Jones III. so I just wanted to share that. People can look up the story on our site if you're curious to kind of go back and see what I'm referring to. But I apologize if I did or if I didn't directly answer the question there, Shanti.
No, that was amazing. And also these are guidelines. They're very big questions, each of them. And I know we have like 20 more minutes until we get to the Q&A. So yeah, that was great. You can, if you want to popcorn pass it to somebody, otherwise I'm just going to pick someone.
Yeah, for sure. I'll toss it back down to Laura.
I thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting how a lot of issues, big issues, pre-pandemic kind of froze over during the pandemic. I mean, it makes sense. But I just remember when I was at the Examiner pre-pandemic, and then I switched to the Business Times 2 months before the pandemic hit. Mental health reform was a huge issue in the city, right? There was the closure of the ARF beds at General Hospital, the long-term treatment beds, and there were just so many different things that were happening in the mental health space. And I feel like that, mental health was a huge conversation topic, but it kind of shifted during the pandemic. So I just thought that was interesting. But as far as going back to what stories we cover and how we choose them. So I basically, every organization that I've worked at, I choose my own stories. I have to pitch them every day. And it can be a little overwhelming sometimes, but there's always something to write about. And I think that's really just part of knowing your beat and feeling comfortable and having sources and having that constant dialogue with your sources. So yeah, my editor, there are times where they will assign me a theme, or if I have to do like a special project or a cover story or something like that, they're like, okay, we want you to focus on the port redevelopment. We want you to focus on this, figure it out, find a story there. But generally it's what I pitch. So I think that's pretty common for most newsrooms. Otis.
Thank you. Yes, it is fairly common, unless you're on like the breaking news beat, and then you have really editors determining what is going to be covered. And then you have to have an editor that has strong news judgment. In my current position at Kqed, I'm really trying to work with reporters and editors on their specific framing of stories. I think journalism to this point hasn't thought deeply about how stories are presented. Just an example. There was the Tulsa Massacre. I hope everyone here is familiar with that. And this year was the 100th anniversary of where white people essentially bombed and killed Black people who had attained some affluency through building a community of their own. Black businesses, Black hotels, Black banks. And they essentially destroyed that and weren't held accountable. Well, so many media organizations did stories on the 100th anniversary. I happened to be at home with my brother watching ABC's piece on this. And the piece was done by a white reporter. Their expert on the massacre was white. The person who was leading the charge to put a plaque up was white, and then another source was white. And I'm like, how could we have this failing, such a significant failing, where we're talking about trauma that happened to Black people, and you're not asking Black people like what that means to them. I feel we fell flat on our face as journalists with health disparities before COVID. But when COVID happened, then we're catching up. One story I think we really missed was people who were incarcerated. I mean, we have a government that literally moved sick inmates to a prison where there weren't any sick inmates, and then they had a coronavirus outbreak. how are those officials not being held accountable for that kind of decision making? And then the police, especially the police. We're in, and I know at the Oaklandside, that's something, Jacob, you guys are having to cover right now, is that budget. And I'm so thankful for the Oaklandside, by the way. We need that deep coverage on Oakland. It's not all San Francisco, but
thank you.
The police don't respond to the underlying issues, poor education, cyclical poverty, lack of opportunities that plague impoverished communities. So when we're talking about gun violence, adding more police isn't going to stop what leads to the violence. And I really feel that we as journalists need to continually point that out. And in my current position, that's what I do with reporters and editors. I prod people to find a different way to tell a story. Like, it's really very easy to go to the police and ask for a quote, but what about the community member? What about trying to see it a different way? Like asking the question, Jacob, which I've been asking when it comes to gun violence, like where the hell do the guns come from? Like they're not being manufactured in these communities. Like we don't have an abundance of gun stores in this state. Where the hell are the guns coming from? What is the pipeline? And what are the police doing to stop that instead of just adding hundreds of police officers as if that's going to stop the violence? And I'm gonna popcorn finally to my man, Joe Fitz.
Oh, snap. I'm gonna take a different slice of this question. You ask about ways audiences can provide input and catch attention, and I think that's really key because access is such a big part of how folks get journalists to cover what they want to see covered, and certainly as journalists find less time and less resources. People who are able to push things in front of their faces will have seen more coverage, and that's a failing in journalism. It's a failing of the way that we present things. Hopefully, it's not one that we feel like we fall prey to often. Hopefully, we're going out there, we're going to communities as much as we can, and trying to find things out from them. But certainly, the biggest failing and the way that we can fall down when we do fall down is falling prey to who has access to us. And it is so incumbent on us to make that effort to reach out beyond the usual suspects, to reach out beyond the people we have already saved in our cell phones. And I know that kind of dovetails back what we were talking about before with time, but it's almost a different way of slicing that idea, just that we need to make sure that we're talking to those people. And some ways, if you are looking for more practical ways of getting in front of us, you can email us, you can call us. We're generally pretty open in those ways. If there are ways to get to journalists through established organizations who might be talking to us already, but one of the ways that access can work, and especially when we're failing, is a lot of people who know how journalists operate know how to phrase a thing to us that sounds more like a story we'd write. You might have something that's a story that is a really great idea, or a really great thing or a terrible thing you're seeing in your community that needs attention, but because you're not someone who has savvy with the media or has experience speaking to us, you may not phrase it in a way that we immediately have recognized. So hopefully we do recognize it, but sometimes people who have better access to us and more practice at it can get us to cover things by framing things in such a way that we recognize it as a story more easily. And that's definitely where we fall down. So if there's one way to circumvent that, it's to maybe go to established organizations who do have practice in framing those things to us, or finding the wider story. That was just one point on that I wanted to make.
I would add, since we have no shame in how we reach out to people, I'll slide in the DMs, I'll do Facebook messages, I'll do Twitter, whatever. So I appreciate that when people do that to me. And I don't, I read everything. I might not respond because of time pressures, but I try to, or even if somebody reaches out to me with a great story that isn't in my beat, isn't something that I can touch for my publication, I may pass it on to Joe or somebody, I don't know. But I think it's always important, just if you have a good tip or you have a story, an issue that needs to be covered, reach out.
Awesome. Everyone's getting really deep. I love this. So yeah, as we're coming up on 4:50, we've got a couple more questions left. This one's kind of a fun one or a not fun one, depending on how online you are. I'm extremely online, but basically, and I think it is relevant, especially in the pandemic, as people have been, shut in, isolated. Social media definitely, as related to Bay Area journalism and NorCal journalism and journalism in general, people have really been popping off and making their opinions heard on the internet, including towards or in the general direction of journalists. So, a lot of people get their news from social media. They might find articles there, right? That is like how a lot more and more people are consuming their news. From journalists who are live tweeting. I know some of you guys are online because I see you there because I'm there. And people weighing in with their concerns about timely and current events. Also, on a positive and negative side, there can be, basically citizen journalism via social media. And sometimes that's good and bringing stuff to light that is important that hasn't been brought to light. And sometimes it's very bad because it'll spread disinformation. It's hard to be able to distinguish rumors from genuine updates, especially when things move so fast. Things get retweeted really quickly, especially during the pandemic, like I said, when everybody's stuck inside. So what suggestions as professionals would you have for people who are trying to parse everything, who are caught in the middle of all this, right? Trying to parse everything that looks like news, but may not be, that they may find on social media? It's a tough one. And also you haven't gone first yet, Laura, so I'm kicking it to you.
That is a tough one. Yeah, it's just we're in the age of social media. I actually had this conversation with a friend during the pandemic who I was a little disappointed because she has a journalist friend, so I feel like it was just disappointing to me. But she got most of her news from Instagram, and I could sense this like distrust with the media. My thought is, we don't always get it right. We don't always, we mess up. We're human. But I think that we do have, as journalists, a team behind us. We have editors who look at our stories, who ask questions. We have other journalists, peers who call us out or who we talk to or whatever. So I think you really just have to be discerning about what you take in, who you follow, check what their motivations are, their credibility, who are they tied to, their affiliations. All that's important, and that's kind of on you as a person who consumes the news to figure out, but I think it's definitely an interesting time for journalists and everybody else. Joe.
Oh gosh, well, yeah, difficult time for sure. It's funny because on the one hand, I want to say, oh, just trust us institutions, But on the other hand, us institutions have fallen flat in our face in quite a few different ways in recent years, especially when it comes to covering communities that need it. And there's been quite a rise in citizen journalism that can be quite interesting and quite helpful. Even partisan journalism in some ways, or advocacy journalists, if you want to, in others. For instance, a lot of folks on Twitter, for instance, might be live tweeting meetings. That's a form of journalism. It's citizen journalism. They're not a journalist by name necessarily. Maybe they're even an advocate. Maybe even they're from Tenants together, and they're out there and they're giving a log of a meeting about rights of tenants in the middle of the pandemic. But that's an act of journalism, and certainly we don't want to be gatekeepers about who is a journalist and who is not. I think the easiest rule of thumb does take time, and that is getting to know those journalists or institutions by the body of their work, watching it, looking at other bodies of work and how they cover the same thing, and then deciding if you trust them based on the continuum of their work and how their work appears in the continuum of other people's work. That takes a little bit of effort on a person's part. It's not as easy as checking a list or flipping a switch or looking for a blue check mark next to their name. But to me, it's the most tried and true way. I'll popcorn to Jake.
Yeah, I think that's, sound advice all around. When it comes to the web, social media that we consume, I mean, there's really insidious stuff like deepfakes, right? That is kind of in our future. I don't have the answer for all of that in terms of, it's almost like we don't have enough information yet about where are we going with this in order to really kind of understand how we need to protect ourselves against it. But just in an everyday sense with just like information and folks, posting stuff on Twitter or IG or what have you. I agree with what my colleagues had to say. I would just encourage people to understand that, social media, in a sense, I think one of its functions is to sort of create echo chambers, communities of people who sort of like share opinions and beliefs, and we all share stuff and things go viral, and social media platforms want things to go viral. And they do when people like each other's stuff. And so I think like naturally echo chambers are created. And I think people just need to be aware of that in the space and understand that sometimes you need to remove yourself from that and get information from other spaces and places and people. And so, certainly like be smart, look beyond tweets and headlines, dig deeper, read entire stories. If you're really interested in something or you think you have an opinion about it, but you're not sure, do your due diligence, and check out what people are writing about or creating media about on different platforms and different publications. And again, I think just like have conversations with real people as well. Like don't allow social media to just be like where the conversation begins and where it ends for you. I think that's just one piece of advice that I would give. And I will toss it to Otis.
Sure. What Jacob said, I want to second that about reading entire stories. We have seen since the former president strolled down the escalator or took an escalator ride that this rise in disinformation, misinformation, and just outright lies by purported media organizations. Media literacy is something that I worry about, particularly in the social media area. I mean, think about it like this. An insurrection was planned using social media platforms. I think it's incumbent on journalists to hold those social media platforms accountable. Like there has to be some sort of retribution for allowing hate and lies to fester and infect people to where now we can't have a discussion based on facts. Like the fact that something is happening and that you can see it, like someone can dispute that fact just because it doesn't fit their worldview. And it's terrifying. It terrifies me. And I think about it every day. I spent time in Atlanta and I went to a Stop the Steal rally on January 6th, the day of the insurrection. And, I'm hanging out with people who are carrying assault rifles in public across the street from the State House as if they're protecting democracy or something. But when I would ask questions, simple question, what has the president at the time, what has he done for people? Well, he did criminal justice. What does that mean? Well, it helps Black people. Okay, well, what does it mean? What does criminal justice mean? And they couldn't tell me. They could not tell me that it only impacted about 150,000 federal prisoners, and this country leads the world in incarceration with over 2 million people incarcerated. He didn't do shit for criminal justice, but just because it flew on social media in easy bites, his supporters think he did something for criminal justice. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversation with people who haven't read up on what they're arguing. And I would just implore people to, even if you don't agree with me or my stance, at least have a knowledge base to have a discussion with me. And that's all I want to do. I want to present information to people so we can have an informed discussion.
Thanks, Otis. And yeah, that is, I think Ida just posted that in the chat. I definitely had that top of mind, you know, where there was a sort of citizens disinformation or citizen journalism website of, you know, that got many things wrong, but, you know, people attributed that to the actual like election loss of Mayor Tubbs in Stockton. And that was really a huge moment where I definitely looked at that and was like, wow, this is getting serious. Obviously the Capitol riots and all the other stuff that's been going on for the last 4 to 5 years, especially too, but that was really close to home. So
yeah, and there's all over the country, particularly where there are news deserts right now, there are nefarious websites masquerading as journalism, and the people that are reading or that are engaging with that content don't know, because it looks like a typical website and it seems to be reported by reporters, but it isn't. It is propaganda, and that is, again, that terrifies me.
We can keep talking about this. We could probably just have a webinar just to discuss this one question, just to discuss social media, because it's really, there's good things and bad things and out of control things like happening with the way that social media is affecting the way that we process information or receive news. And I say that as somebody who is on Twitter all day, way too often, way too long, personally. Well, this was amazing. And now I realize it's 4:53 and we have a bunch of audience questions that I do want to get to. So I am going to start with the first one. And this is from someone who is also in journalism, a fellow practitioner. They said, in general, I was pretty disappointed in the COVID school coverage in San Francisco. You know, this is a very loaded topic. I was wondering if there were lessons learned from this time. There was a somewhat related, that's their phrasing, not mine, somewhat related second question, are your news orgs adding a labor desk? Interesting. If anyone wants to take that.
I would love to tackle that one, because that is a topic that I wrote about, and a lot of the, if that's all right with y'all, and a lot of the writing was honestly informed by that dynamic that the asker is talking about. And certainly my perception is that was based on my experience and my time in San Francisco, having attended public schools in San Francisco and being from the city, and also having only ever practiced journalism here. I really think that the coverage of schools was a lot fueled by access. There's a lot of access to reporters who covered that issue, and they were the loudest voices and they were the privileged voices, and those voices definitely carried the news day. Not saying that other voices did not get covered. In fact, they did. But there is something to be said for the weight we give certain voices in journalism, the amount of coverage, the size of the headline for the stories that cover them, whether that's in print or on the web. And certainly that access, and the access we talked about before, played a huge role. And I think that once you start talking to monolingual communities with the help of translations and you start talking to folks who actually are the majority of the people who attend the schools, honestly, in terms of public school, SFUSD, the number of white families in SFUSD is actually quite minuscule compared to other families. The fact that their voices were sometimes amplified more than many, and then talking about ethnic groups in terms of, oh, but this affects them too because of these studies that we saw. And yeah, the studies are important, but you got to talk to them too. And if you're not centering them in your reporting, and if you're not talking to them and putting them dead front and center in a lot of reporting, then someone is getting access, and that's shaping things. And it's not to say that you're not doing any stories about those other folks, but it's informing that conversation, and that is unfortunate. And we saw a weakened is also an example of a weakened press, because there are not as many institutions. And when we used to have a proliferation, a cornucopia of media institutions that were strong, covering one geographic area, we could see different points of view emerge and different people emerge who are taking the focus. And we definitely saw that dynamic at play, that the weakened cornucopia of press.
Great answer. Thanks, Joe. Anybody else want to take this one? Have thoughts?
I'll piggyback on that a little bit, just because what you're saying, Joe, really resonates. As an organization covering Oakland specifically, we have the only full-time reporter covering schools in the city of Oakland, you know? And I'm not saying that because I'm patting ourselves on the back. I'm saying that's terrible, you know? We need a lot more than that in order to cover schools and education in the way that people deserve, right? So yeah, I just want to echo that. I mean, you know, I personally feel like our education reporter, Ashley McBride, has done an incredible job covering schools in Oakland. But, you know, education is so complicated, and it's tough when you have diminished resources and just like journalism capacity to cover schools as an issue, you know, and that was true before the pandemic too.
Anyone want to take that, or talk about labor reporting? Because that was the side question. Anyone getting a labor
I would
desk?
urge you to check out a program called Bay News Rising. It's great. I love it. It's not quite what the question asker is asking, but it's a program by the Chronicles Guild, the local 39521, and bless them for doing this, who teach student journalists in the Bay Area how to cover labor every summer. And it's a great program. It's been running for a few years. Started out of the Guild. Support it if you want to support labor reporting.
I will also put in a pitch. Unsurprisingly, as a DSA member, I do know a lot of labor journalists across the country, or upcoming labor journalists across the country. So if you want to check out Strike Wave, one word, like a wave, definitely check them out too, because they have a lot of great folks, some of whom are SF based, or were SF based, or will hopefully be coming back and hanging out with me sometime soon. Cool. Oh yeah, go for it.
I'd just like to say how many journalists became Kqed reporters during the last, I don't know, year. I think we're going to have more journalists become labor reporters, because it feels like we are in the midst of a labor movement right now that could reset how work is done in this country. You take right now with Prop 22. I'm really interested in that, and I'm looking into like a year after how have the drivers been impacted? How have the customers been impacted beyond the surge in pricing that's not being passed on to the drivers? Yeah, we have restaurants and bars right now that are in shortened hours because they don't have enough staff, and they don't know if they're going to have enough people. So, and then we have people just quitting their jobs because they don't want to go back to the office. I believe we're in the midst of a labor movement that we haven't seen in decades. So yes, there will be more coverage on labor for sure.
From an office worker standpoint, I think it's just been really interesting too, of how the workplace has been changing and the role of the office, and how that impacts, you know, transportation and commuting and all those things. So I think there's definitely so much room to cover this, and it kind of, I find myself kind of, you know, not just doing real estate or housing or all that, it's also about like the workplace and what the decisions that companies are making right now, and it's also in flux. I mean, people are figuring it out as we go. My job's figuring it out, you know. It's kind of just such an interesting shift that is here to stay after the pandemic, I'm sure, and it affects everybody. It affects the office workers, it affects the restaurant workers, it affects everybody. So.
All right, next question. We're covering all the hot topics today. So the next question concerns the conflict in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine. US coverage of Palestine, this is the question, I'm reading it. US coverage of Palestine seems to go against the values of good journalism. It seems biased and doesn't reflect the real issues affecting Palestinians. How can reporters do better? It's a big one. So whoever wants to take that one first. Well, if you need a minute, I'll give you a minute.
I'm not on mute, so I will I'll take it. Yes, that is something that in my current workplace that I have had long talks about, and how our reporting is presented when we do discuss what's happening. But what it boils down to me is very similar to how I feel about what's happening in impoverished communities that are continually being attacked by the state. And I feel that we as people who are relatively privileged, I mean, we all have internet, we're sitting down, we're having a conversation, that we need to be more in tune with human rights abuses, and that goes for the border, that goes through to our next door neighbor, that goes to Palestinians. This issue has broader implications because it's reflective of who we are as humans and how we treat people who need help in society. And I think as reporters, we need to read up more on the origins, and if, without saying too much, I don't want to take everyone's time, but we need to know more about the origins and who is being harmed and who is doing the harming.
I think that's well said, man. You know, I mean, we're a hyperlocal kind of news organization. We're not covering the Middle East. So I'm not speaking as, you know, kind of like taking off my managing editor of the Oaklandside hat and just kind of speaking more broadly about, the, you know, just kind of, I guess, reacting to the question. I think one of the reasons why it's difficult to kind of just like come up with an answer is because that is the narrative, right, that we're talking about, the narrative that is all packaged around the Middle East conflict between Israel and Palestine, is a narrative that's been, you know, crafted and held up for years and years and years and years. And it's been reinforced in so many different ways. And it's also, I believe, deeply racialized, so that when people think about that conflict, you think of like, oh, like the brown folks, the Palestinians, like throwing stones, and then you have like the Israelis, and people have these notions about good and bad that are just deeply ingrained, and also, I think, to some degree, like, you know, intertwined with racism and, you know, the way we view things, unfortunately, historically in our country. So it's a lot to unpack, in other words, and I don't have like a good answer for the audience member who asked the question, really, like, what can journalists do? I think maybe the best answer I can give is kind of coming back to something that I think we were discussing at the beginning of this call, which was just thinking about whose voices we're centering in our reporting, you know, and whose experiences are we sort of like lifting up, and who is really impacted. You know, so yeah, I mean, I'm going to stop there because I'm kind of getting out of my, sort of comfort zone in terms of what I do every day and what I'm dealing with as a journalist. But those are just some kind of big picture thoughts.
Yeah. No, thank you. These are some tough questions and good questions. We had a situation where first people were a little reticent to put in Q&A stuff, and now all of a sudden we have a ton of Q&A questions to get through. So forgive me, I'm going to try to triage this, speed run it slightly, maybe combine things. I apologize to anybody if you feel your question isn't asked or done justice. I will do my best. But we'll switch it up a little bit and make this the advice section of this panel, which is for writers who are more interested in opinion journalism on current topics. What are some tips and tricks when talking and interviewing others, as well as the writing process? I know some of y'all have opinion experience, so if you want to.
Joe?
Oh yeah, I have opinion experience. That's right. I was a columnist for a good 6 years. I think the best advice someone ever gave me when developing my column was because it was a political column, right? It's called On Guard. The idea was as a progressive a columnist in San Francisco covering politics and life in the city. But despite that kind of definition I just gave of myself, the best advice anyone ever gave me was to develop an internal set of principles to make sure that I applied those principles evenly and was not, bonking one politician over the head for failing to do one thing and giving another politician a pass over the same thing. And it's so funny because, sometimes people will come up to me and, people try to view you through their lens. They're like, oh, you give, this progressive a pass on this thing, but you had knocked this moderate or mayor over the head for the same thing just earlier. I'm like, actually, no, I wrote about that. I actually said that so-and-so was speaking out of both sides of their mouth. And, I have it right there for you. And having those internal principles is a big deal. Also, applying the same type of questions as you would to the objective journalism, the kind of the traditional news journalism as you do to opinion, I think was really helpful. You ask open-ended questions. You don't load those questions. You don't lead with your questions. You make sure you're getting honest answers, and you have to check your own privileges and biases as much as you can and try to come around on things. I certainly wrote columns where I came around on something and said, you know what, I was wrong. And here, let me tell you how I came to this process of where I was wrong. And I thought it was healthy to do that. And some of the best feedback I ever got was like from people who were, say, more moderate leaning folks or conservative leaning folks who said, you know what, I don't share your views, but I like that you explain your process and you make me think. And that is some of the best feedback you can get and shows that you're trying to see from different perspectives.
So I've never been a columnist, so I definitely go for the objective route. But I think, the best feedback that you can get, and it's kind of relating to what Joe was saying, is from somebody who you write about and they might not be happy with what you're writing, but they respect what you wrote, and they respect the fact that like you told the story, you gave them a voice, you gave the other side a voice, you gave the third side a voice, and I think that that's, as a journalist, that's what you got to do. Just a thought.
I'll move on unless anyone has any last thoughts. This is more in the advice vein. So this is sort of the advice for aspiring journalists. So I presume an aspiring journalist is asking this question. But what do you wish that you had done differently or that you would have known before going into the field? It's a big one. I should put on the Jeopardy music.
I don't mean to speak first twice, but since folks seem to be mulling it over, I'll say that one thing I recommend people a lot when journalism students come up to me and they ask me, should I go to journalism school? And sometimes it depends on the person. And I would say don't make sure it's not an automatic yes for you. For some people, it may be beneficial to go for journalism school, but for some people, actually, may be more beneficial to study a topic area, to really become a topic area expert, especially if you plan on focusing on one thing in journalism. and that maybe community college is a better route for you to just learn some of the basics, or take a few classes here or there, or get a mentor. There's a lot of different routes into journalism, and it doesn't necessarily have to go through journalism school.
I would say definitely do whatever you can to put out work, put out your writing, whether you are in a journalism job or you're in school or you're in an internship, where you maybe don't have the opportunity to publish all the time, do it on your own, or try to just at least show that initiative, because that's what your job is, right? And I actually was interested if I can ask a question to Joe. I know that, you do a lot of mentoring as well. And I've seen that myself. But do you feel like the industry is changing a little bit with, I always felt with journalism, yeah, you can go the school route, or you can just be a badass and put your stuff out there and network and get those jobs. Do you feel like that's still kind of the scene right now? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think certainly one of the biggest troubles that we were talking about earlier with, and you're so keen to ask that question, Laura, is that one of the things we're talking about in terms of who is in journalism, right? Like if there are unpaid internships out there, who can afford those unpaid internships?
Exactly.
And who gets into those jobs? It's definitely a lot rougher if you don't have the padding of, another income or a spouse or a family that can support you through it all. That's one of the biggest troubles in journalism as the financial realities hit. So I definitely, the reality is definitely harsher for those who don't have the privilege to practice journalism for free or for low cost at first. And that's one of the hardest parts to get in. And it's a reality I think you're keen to highlight, and anyone who's looking into journalism should realize is just how it is out there right now, as terrible as it is.
And I think, it's kind of from the organization perspective or employer perspective, I feel like, and you and I have had these conversations at the Examiner, internship programs, and who gets that pipeline into these organizations, into these jobs. Is it, not trying to call anybody out, but is it Stanford, or is it City College? Is it SF State, or is it, I mean, that kind of stuff is important too. And I think, and I've seen that along the way where maybe that pipeline wasn't always established. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think there's so much talent everywhere. And we're just gonna create that opportunity for people. Not so much advice, but.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything actually that Joe and Laura are saying. And this is coming from someone who, I actually, before coming to the Oaklandside, I was running journalism programs for young people, and not young people that already had opportunities, but, young people that, we were given sort of a foothold in the industry to like take it forward if they wanted to. And I just think it's important for news organizations that have the resources to do so, to actually work to create their own pipelines, right? Because there's a lot of power in that. Like organizations need to play an active role in creating those pipelines and recruiting people and training people up, and then the other thing that I would say is just sort of echoing in terms of advice to young people. And I think you might have said this, Joe, but the importance of, or someone did, but the importance of finding mentors is super crucial. And I always encourage young people to not be afraid to reach out. If there are people out there who you admire, and like folks who you say to yourself, like, I kind of want to be them in 5 years or 10 years, reach out. Because in my experience, most journalists, most people, if there's a sincere sort of interest that someone takes and they want to have a conversation, like most people will oblige that, like have a conversation, like get together, have a cup of coffee, like talk to a young person about, give them some advice. And so I always tell young people to not be afraid to reach out. And then also to, and this is a tough one, but to not be discouraged in spaces where they feel like, they're the other, maybe. Because again, journalism spaces are not always, they don't always feel inclusive, and so if you're coming from a place where you feel like you don't belong, it can be intimidating. And so I always, just encourage young people, if they're like, going to school still and like thinking about a career in journalism, if they're really passionate about it and they want to do it, to just really hold on to their self-confidence, and just be aware that, if they have the passions, can be for them. I know that sounds kind of a little, pie in the sky-ish, but I think it's important. It's an important message to send to young folks.
Thanks. All right, now we're going to get to some of the hard-hitting questions. This is the hard-hitting section for a little bit, and then I hope if we have time, I'll ask a fun one. So the next question is, do you always ask whom you're interviewing what their pronouns and gender are? Do you just assume? I'm asking because this is the commenter asker, always so surprised how misgendered I've been in the city, and it makes me want to talk to reporters less due to misgendering. So, and of course, the question is if you do it, but also is that a problem that you may be seen in the journalism community?
Yes. I mean, just quite simply, yes. I think it's irresponsible if you're a journalist and you don't ask. Kqed right now is going through an internal source audit that I'm on the team pushing for that. And one of the questions is to ask a person's pronoun. Now, I have just a little internal stuff going on right now. There is some resistance on just having to ask, a person's race, what their job is, what their pronoun is. But as a journalist, especially coming from print journalism, that was the shit you asked all the time anyway. So I don't know why it's so hard in radio, but yes, you have to ask. And it's and if to the person who asked the question, if they don't ask, tell them. Like, we don't know everything. And yes, because of time, sometimes we're trying to cut corners. But yeah, if they don't ask you, tell them. Please speak it loud so you aren't misrepresented.
And for those who are curious, I dropped our kind of first Kqed's first source audit, which was done by an outside organization into us retroactively with aid of people internally. And that's there in a PDF I dropped in the chat.
Thank you. Also, I did an interview with Kqed, and I was a recipient of that survey a couple days ago, actually, possibly even yesterday. This week's been a little fuzzy, but thank you.
That makes me happy because I've been stressing people, editors, about that. Like, fill out your source audit, make sure your teams are filling it out. Yes. That's
the first time anyone has asked me that comprehensively in an interview before. So it worked on me. So
awesome.
I'm going to move on. Sorry if I'm shortening this now, but we're getting to the last 10 minutes. But next question is, what can I do if I see a reporter, or what can you do as a reporter? If I see a reporter demonstrate a clear bias in favor of one advocacy group over another concerning city controversies and politics. I know we touched on this a little bit. If there's anything else anyone wants to add about what that looks like. Anyone who's been yelled at on Twitter? I'm not trying to single you out, Joe. I assume everyone's been yelled at on Twitter for this at some point. If you want to provide go for it.
The thing is that it's like, what can I do? Well, you can talk to us. I mean, we're right here. Like, we all have Twitter profiles, we all have email addresses, and we all have phone numbers. If you're a quality journalism, you'll pick up the call, or you'll make the call and you'll take it. And I feel I'm trying to be as informed as I can be because I'm trying to educate the public. I would rather you reach out to me and let's have a conversation than you stew on it and then it becomes something else. Just talk to me. And then don't be put off if that reporter questions your bias. Because I think the way the question is framed, that that maybe you care, or you're in league with the other advocacy group, or one or the other. But to answer the question, talk to us. We are there to talk. We are there to listen if we're quality journalists.
Nothing to add, but just want to say that was excellent, Otis. Yeah, just have a conversation with us. You know, we're learning every day as well, and that's our job. And you know, we're here to talk to you, so talk to us.
All right, one more question, and then maybe I think if we can squeeze in a fun one, we will. If we can't, we can't. So this one is, does search engine optimization factor into which stories are published, how they're written, or how they're framed, thinking catchy headlines? Definitely something I've experienced where the headline and the article seem different. And I know that's not within the writer's control, but have you seen pressure, constraints on your work, even if it's just in the headline space, in order to produce journalism that sort of breaks through the algorithm or gets a lot of eyeballs on it?
You know, it's certainly, you know, what keywords people are putting up to the top is sometimes a consideration, but not, I would flip it. I would flip that frame of thinking. Like, for instance, I was working with I did the first edition of a big explainer on how you could get your vaccines back when people were worried about accessing their vaccines before they were so everywhere, right? And it was incumbent upon us, because people were asking the question, how can I get my vaccine, for us to figure out how are people searching to make sure that they're getting their vaccine. So it's not as much about us trying to juice our clicks as it is trying to say, hey, what are people reaching out to find out? What do they want to know? And how can we use technology, use search engine data to tell us what our audience is hungry to know? And that's not the end of the story ever. It's always a question of also of a million other editorial questions, whether it's equity and fronting a community in the discussion. Like, you know, I recall another day we have a kind of a group chat about headlines, and we talk about, you know, we all kind of talk about what the headline should be. Everyone gives a little input. And, you know, there was a question about clarity, about what people recognize more easily and would be more likely to say, oh, I know what that is, and click that, over being more specific. And there's always a balance, and you try your best, and sometimes you might find a way to get at both needs, and that's always a discussion.
Well said.
All right. Anybody else got any answers to that, or I can move on? I'll move on to the fun question. Actually, wait. Maybe I can slip in one more tough one. I'm sorry. Then we'll go to the fun one. So someone had asked, to Otis's point about media literacy, what can journalists do to foster this? Or from another perspective, what are the top 3 questions that citizens can ask to help them ask themselves to help them assess the credibility of the news that they're consuming? I know this is tough. It's a good one. Blue check? No, not really.
I would have to stew on the questions about the how to assess the credibility, because it's almost like, you know, like being journalists just going through the sea of news, we kind of develop our own ideas, maybe perhaps without articulating them necessarily. But I think one thing that is helpful is this person a subject matter expert? You know, like and that's only one criteria. And sometimes that person may not be the best subject matter expert. But I think that's certainly one that I would look at.
I guess another question might be, is there an underlying agenda or like motive that this individual or organization that's putting out the information has, that isn't just in service to the veracity of like the information? Is there an ulterior motive?
I think I said this earlier, but, you know, check the affiliation of the person that is, you know, talking on Twitter, or the reporter, you know, who are they connected to, what the publication. I mean, that's one way to kind of look into what the slant is, or the, you know, the motivation. But I think to the point of what can reporters do to help media literacy, I actually want to give a shout out to Ida, because I think this has been a really great discussion. And I think talking about what we do, because I feel like, you know, we don't, I mean, when do you do this? Not too often, right? So I think just having conversations, or if somebody has questions, reaching out, even if it's not related to what you're doing, and just explaining how it works. And I find myself sometimes having to do that even with sources or people who reach out to me because they expect something from me, or they, you know, we have a discussion and I feel like I have to let them know this is actually part of the job, or this is what I have to do. And it's not, you know, my call always. So I don't know, I just think having an open dialogue and being accessible and, you know, answering questions that people might have is the start.
And Ida just posted a link to a quiz in the chat, which is, I love taking quizzes. So this is bait for me. I'll post my embarrassing answer on Twitter later. Anybody else got anything before we go to our fun question? And then I will let Ida wrap it up. The fun question, this could be totally off the cuff. It could be something big and profound. It could be something really little that's just making you happy or annoying you right now. But you know, what is your favorite and or least favorite thing about being a journalist? Feel free to be loose with the answer. Could be your least favorite thing or your favorite thing this week or this year or forever.
My favorite thing about being a journalist is, but no, seriously, it's about representing people who have been overlooked. I want my life to have meaning, and at the very core of who I am as a person is trying to help people who are overlooked. I mean, you drive through the Bay Area and you see people living in such squalor, and why the hell can we not help them with all of this wealth concentrated in this area? I think about it every day. This is not something, and this is no cap to this. This is what consumes me. And who is responsible for that? And what systems are at play that created this situation for people? That is my favorite thing about journalism. And it's also my least favorite because it makes my heart and body ache to see people suffering, and then be able to walk into a council meeting and seeing people who live comfortably arguing and not coming up with solutions. And I think it's frustrating, and there has to be a point where communities gather and come together to demand changes. And that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, I think I mean, everybody has different motivations, right? But I think the reason I got into journalism, obviously I love my job. I love writing. I love learning something new every day. I love dealing with people. But I think that for me, it's, you know, when I'm working on a story where I know in my heart that it's a great story, not because of the clicks, but maybe because it will make a difference in somebody's life, it'll change somebody's situation. I think that's just the best feeling that you can have as a human. And I think that's, you know, what we strive for. We may not always hit that mark, but I think that's something to strive for. And I think that's something that's the most valuable thing that you can take away from this job. You know, you live for that. But I think the most difficult thing right now I'm dealing with, I got a really good story and having a hard time nailing it down, you know, just because people aren't talking. And I think it's frustrating sometimes. There are really frustrating aspects about this job for sure. You really just have to be persistent and sometimes learn to let things go and come back to them, or just let things breathe. And that can be difficult if you get really focused on, you know, your story or whatever you're working on. And another thing, I say this again, you know, just frustrating working with people who maybe don't understand how your job works, which is fair because I don't understand how other people's jobs work all the time. But, you know, just having that friction sometimes can be challenging.
I'll go next, I guess. And I'm sort of echoing some things that have been said already, but it just sort of speaks to, I think, what does drive a lot of us to do what we do. But it is sort of the sense of mission, the urge to be of service to other people. You know, like I came to journalism later in life, not late, but I kind of did a pivot. So I was doing community-based work in San Francisco, and I was working with immigrant families and kids. I was a counselor, and I was like directing after-school programs, and I was hearing a lot of stories from families and young people. And actually hearing those stories inspired me to kind of just actually follow this other path and this other interest I had in storytelling and media and journalism. And I wanted to learn more about that. And how could I, take these stories that I was hearing in these little rooms at Mission High School, when these young people were telling me, and actually kind of like translate that in a way that like other people would be able to also feel some empathy for what these young folks were going through. And so for me, yeah, it's still about that. It's about just using journalism, that's my toolkit now, but it's all in service to hopefully, people, community. And so, yeah, that's the beautiful thing about journalism for me as well. Yeah, and Laura's right. There's a lot of hard stuff about it too, and so, which is why I've always told young people that think they have an interest in journalism, just really let your heart lead, because it's not going to be about making $1 million or like, very few of us are going to get to that level. It's got to really be like coming from here. And if you feel that way, then like, go all in, so.
The greatest thing and the toughest thing about journalism is all those wins and losses we're talking about, right? Helping people be seen, helping communities be seen, helping people who are underserved, is sometimes it can feel like your successes are only last as long as people are reading that headline, and then they're gone. But then your failures are the same way too, right? You tomorrow's another day, tomorrow's another story. You can always keep going, you can always keep pushing. And sometimes it can feel both inspiring and hopeless for that same reason. So I started to think of it and visualize it like this, like our society or the world or our little slice of it here in the Bay Area moves along like a great ship in an ocean, and all you can do is do your best to be at to help steer it, to help pull all the different levers of society to make sure that it's moving and humming along, and as few people are getting hurt along the way, and as many people are getting helped along the way. And you only have a little time to help pull those levers, and then it's someone else's turn, and that ship keeps humming, it keeps going, and you can only do your best to keep it on course in the time you have. And that helps me cope with that feeling a lot. Otherwise, sometimes it just feels too big.
Oh my God, you're making me cry. You're gonna make me cry. I'm trying not to cry, which is why I'm gonna say thank you and pass it on to Ida quickly before I start crying.
That was beautiful, Joe. That was the way to end it on a high note. Thank you everyone so much for coming, to our lovely panelists, for bringing your expertise and thoughtfulness, not only to what you do every day, but to this panel, or I'll flip that. And to Shanti for moderating, being our conduit for the public. I put in some notes about how to get involved with SPJ NorCal, and then also the reporter handles to, hit us up with questions, story ideas, reasonable feedback. So I'll just let you guys all go now, and thanks again so much for coming. And this will be recorded, so it'll be posted on our YouTube.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Hooray. I'm going to log off unless we're done.